The courthouse sat in the heart of the small U.S. city, its bricks sunlit and warm against the crisp February air. Inside, the marble floors echoed with the shuffle of papers and the quiet murmur of voices. In courtroom 3B, a serious case was unfolding, a robbery investigation involving multiple witnesses, a few suspects, and a single key piece of evidence that could change everything. The room itself was typical for such proceedings: tall wooden benches, a high judge's bench polished to a shine, and the solemn presence of law enforcement personnel in uniforms. The scent of coffee and faint cleaning polish lingered in the air, unnoticed amid the tense atmosphere. Judge Harrison sat at the center, a middle-aged man with silver-streaked hair and glasses perched low on his nose. His hands rested on the gavel, which he would occasionally lift to command attention, his voice steady but firm. Today, his eyes were fixed on the lawyers, both trying to make their points in a legal back-and-forth that had already consumed hours of testimony. One attorney was gesturing emphatically, papers rustling in her hands as she recounted the night of the crime. The other, calm and measured, took notes and then raised his gaze to deliver his rebuttal. Every word seemed critical, every gesture under scrutiny. Beside Officer Daniels, the handler for the court's K-9 unit, sat Max, a large German shepherd with a coat as dark as midnight and eyes that held an almost uncanny intelligence. Max had been trained to detect drugs, explosives, and suspicious behaviors, but in the courtroom his presence was also a deterrent, a symbol of law, order, and authority. He sat perfectly still, ears perked, occasionally shifting his gaze from the attorneys to the spectators, a silent sentinel. His chest rose and fell in measured rhythm, his paws resting neatly together, his head tilting slightly whenever he detected a sudden movement. At the far back of the courtroom, hidden among the sea of adults and solemn faces, sat a small child. A 3-year-old girl clutched her mother's hand tightly. Her mother, a petite woman with soft brown hair and glasses, whispered quiet encouragements to keep her seated and attentive. Wide, innocent eyes darted around the room, absorbing every detail: the sharp lines of the judge's bench, the loud rustling of paper from the attorneys, the quick movements of officers, and most captivating of all, the dark, alert figure of Max. Had been fascinated by dogs for as long as she could remember, but there was something different about Max. Even at this distance, she could sense his attention and his intelligence. He wasn't just a dog, he was something more: alert, aware, and seemingly understanding the world in a way humans often overlooked. Her tiny fingers twitched, and without even thinking, she pointed at him once, then again. At first, no one noticed. Adults in the courtroom were absorbed in legal jargon, evidence, and the drama of human conflict, entirely unaware that a silent, subtle exchange was about to unfold. The courtroom's tension was palpable. Lawyers spoke in precise, rehearsed tones, each word carrying the weight of their client's future. Witnesses were on edge, their hands wringing or shaking, eyes darting nervously between the judge and the attorneys. The sound of a gavel striking wood echoed as Judge Harrison called for order, reminding the room of decorum. The audience nodded, muttering polite agreements, but no one noticed small gestures. She was like a quiet ripple in a vast, stormy lake, small, delicate, but destined to expand beyond expectation. Max, however, noticed. The dog's ears flicked slightly, and his head turned toward the small figure in the gallery. His eyes softened, yet they held the intensity of someone and something ready to act. Officer Daniels, trained to read these cues, observed Max with a practiced eye. Something was different. The dog's usual focus on the courtroom proceedings had shifted, subtle at first, almost imperceptible but undeniable. Max was no longer solely watching the attorneys or the judge. He was watching the little girl. "Are you ready?" her mother whispered softly. Lips pursed in concentration, her fingers still twitching toward Max. Her mind, though small and innocent, seemed to understand something adults did not. The dog was responding to her, not to the commands of his handler, not to the formalities of the courtroom, but to her small, simple gestures. She didn't understand why yet, but instinctively she knew she was being heard. Around them, the courtroom carried on. The defense attorney gestured toward a witness, prompting a recollection of the night in question. "And you saw him leave the store at precisely what time?" she asked, voice deliberate. The witness nodded, fidgeting slightly. "Around 9:15 p.m., he replied. "Did you see anyone else nearby?" The exchange seemed normal, mundane, but attention had drifted. Her finger twitched again toward Max. This time her gesture was firmer, more intentional, as if she were saying, "Watch this." Max's posture shifted, subtle yet noticeable. His chest rose as he inhaled sharply, and he rose from his seated position, muscles tensing beneath his shiny coat. Officer Daniel's eyes widened slightly, though he maintained his composure. This was unusual. Max had never reacted this way in a courtroom unless there was an alert, a danger, or an instruction that required immediate attention. And yet the trigger was not any human command. It was a tiny, 3-year-old child pointing quietly from the gallery. His mother felt a small shiver run down her spine. "Stay calm," she whispered, though she herself was beginning to feel a mix of awe and apprehension. Other spectators remained unaware, absorbed in the formal proceedings, the legal intricacies, and the slow passage of time. The moment between Max and was invisible to most, but for those paying attention, the dog, the child, and her mother, the air was electric with anticipation. The judge paused mid-note, glancing at Max. Something seemed off, though he could not yet pinpoint it. Max's eyes locked on, unwavering, and the dog's body remained rigid yet calm, like a soldier on high alert. The small girl tilted her head slightly, her fingers twitching again, and Max took another careful step closer, ears forward, muscles ready to respond. Officer Daniels, sensing the unusual behavior, leaned slightly forward, voice ready to command if necessary. But Max ignored him, focused entirely on. Whispers began to ripple subtly through the courtroom as a few keen observers noticed the unusual interaction. "Is that the dog moving on its own?" one whispered to another. Cameras flashed quietly, journalists sensing a potential story beyond the courtroom drama. Lawyers paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward the back where sat, hand frozen in a gesture no one yet understood. Even Judge Harrison's stern expression softened momentarily into curiosity. Something extraordinary was happening. And so, amid the routine of legal arguments, the shuffle of papers, and the tense testimony of witnesses, a quiet, invisible exchange took place. A 3-year-old girl, small and innocent, and a police dog, trained, alert, and obedient, communicated in a language no one else understood. It was a prelude, a moment of calm before the storm, and no one in that crowded courtroom yet realized that the events unfolding in the gallery would soon stop everything in its tracks. In that instant, and Max shared a connection that transcended words. The courtroom, heavy with the weight of law and procedure, unknowingly became a stage for something extraordinary. A child's innocent gesture, unnoticed by most, began to ripple outward, ready to change the course of the day. Every eye in the room would soon turn to this tiny figure. Every ear would strain to hear the silent communication, and the solemnity of the courtroom would be forever altered by the bond between a girl and a dog. The courtroom seemed to hum with the low, steady rhythm of the proceedings, but too, it was alive in a way that no adult could comprehend. She leaned slightly forward, her small body perched on the edge of the bench. Her eyes, wide and bright, scanned the room with intense curiosity. Adults around her were focused on legal arguments, evidence, and testimony, yet she was drawn to one figure who seemed different from everyone else: Max, the police dog. His dark eyes, sharp yet gentle, met hers for the first time, and in that instant felt a quiet recognition, as if he understood her in a way the humans could not. She tugged slightly at her mother's hand, pointing ever so subtly. Her finger twitched toward Max, then hovered, unsure if the gesture was correct. Her mother glanced down, whispering, "Be careful, sweetheart, just sit still," but barely registered the words. She had learned from countless evenings watching dogs on TV and visiting the park that Max was no ordinary dog. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, the slight tilt of his head, told her he was listening. Max, in fact, was listening. The handler, Officer Daniels, had noticed a small change in the dog's demeanor. A subtle shift in weight, a slight flick of the ear, and a tension in the shoulders suggested Max's attention had drifted from the usual courtroom activity. He was focused on. Daniels' trained eye caught the difference immediately. The dog was responding to something, or someone, outside the normal parameters. His mind raced, calculating every possibility, but he could not interfere too abruptly. Max was calm but ready to act, as if sensing an unspoken instruction from the tiny figure in the gallery. His heart raced with excitement. She didn't understand why Max was responding, only that he was. She pointed again, this time with more intent, and her small body leaned slightly forward. To her it was a game of sorts, a test to see if the dog truly understood. But the subtle movement carried weight she could not yet measure. Max shifted a paw slightly, then another, inching his massive frame closer. The courtroom, focused on the legal drama, remained largely oblivious. Lawyers gestured, witnesses fidgeted, and the judge made notes, all unaware that an extraordinary silent communication was taking place in plain sight. The tension in the air was nearly imperceptible at first. A few spectators noticed the slight motion of Max but assumed it was a routine adjustment, a dog reacting to a change in scent or sound. Yet, too, every movement carried meaning. She could feel it in the warmth of his eyes, the controlled energy in his posture. She leaned even closer, pointing with intention, and whispered softly to herself, "Do you see it?" Her mother smiled nervously, unsure whether to intervene, sensing that had stumbled into something unusual, though not dangerous. Officer Daniels' gaze never left Max. His mind raced. Dogs of Max's training level were incredibly disciplined, responding only to their handlers or highly trained stimuli. Yet here was a scenario that normal behavior, a small child, untrained, seemed to be issuing commands or guidance that Max recognized instantly. Daniels quietly assessed the room, noting the proximity of the judge, the scattered attention of lawyers, and the array of witnesses. No one else noticed anything out of the ordinary, but he did. A knot of anticipation tightened in his stomach. Max's response grew more deliberate. He shifted forward, his paws pressing firmly against the polished floor. His eyes never left. A slight twitch of his ears indicated readiness, his muscles coiled with the potential for movement. To anyone watching without context, he appeared merely alert, attentive to the formalities of the courtroom. But to those trained to notice, and to herself, this was a clear sign. Max was responding to her, entirely on her cue and nothing else. The judge, still reviewing documents, glanced up briefly. "Is the dog moving?" he asked, frowning. His voice was low but carried across the room. Officers around him shifted uneasily, whispering to one another. The attorneys froze mid-gesture, pens in hand. Even the witnesses turned slightly, trying to understand the distraction. For the first time, the adults became aware of something unusual, however, did not flinch. She pointed again, deliberately, and Max responded with subtle precision, maintaining eye contact as if waiting for confirmation. A sense of anticipation grew in the courtroom. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that the dog? Is it obeying a child?" Some spectators laughed nervously, thinking it a trick or coincidence. Others leaned forward, cameras poised to capture a moment they sensed might be extraordinary. His mother gripped her daughter's shoulder gently, whispering, "What are you doing, honey?" Barely responded, focused entirely on Max, confident that he understood her. The connection between them deepened. Max moved slightly closer, a paw lifted, ready to act but restrained by his training. Gestures became clearer, more intentional, though still small and almost imperceptible to untrained eyes. The child's focus was absolute, her tiny heart racing with excitement and curiosity. She did not yet know what would happen next, only that Max was listening and responding. Officer Daniels finally spoke softly, leaning close to the dog. "Max, easy." The dog hesitated but did not break focus. This confirmed what Daniels had feared and admired. Max was following an entirely untrained command, interpreting the child's signal as if it had been drilled into him over months of training. The sheer intelligence of the dog, combined with the innocence of the girl, created a tension that hung in the room like a thick, invisible curtain. His finger hovered, then pointed again, more decisively. Max's ears flicked, his stance shifted. It was a moment suspended in time. The adults in the courtroom began to notice subtle signs: the stillness of the dog, the unwavering gaze, the intensity that seemed disproportionate for a child so small. Cameras clicked quietly, journalists scribbled notes, and lawyers paused mid-sentence. The rhythm of the courtroom, once steady and predictable, was beginning to falter under the silent command of a 3-year-old girl. The judge, now fully attentive, set aside his papers. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room for explanations. "Officer Daniels," he asked, "is the dog okay?" Daniels nodded, voice steady but tinged with concern. "Yes, Your Honor, he's alert but reacting to something unusual." The courtroom murmured, witnesses craned their necks, and reporters whispered into recorders. Every adult present felt a shift in the atmosphere, though none could yet fully grasp what had prompted it. Remained calm, almost serene, her small body poised and eyes wide. She pointed once more, and Max's massive head tilted slightly, ears forward, muscles coiled. He had chosen to listen to her over anyone else in the room. The bond between them, invisible yet undeniable, had taken root. And in that moment, the entire courtroom, filled with adults accustomed to authority and procedure, became spectators to an extraordinary, unspoken conversation between a child and a dog. The tension lingered. Time seemed to slow. The mundane legal proceedings faded to the background, replaced by the awe of witnessing something rare and remarkable. Gestures were small, but they carried power. Max's response was disciplined, precise, and unwavering. Together, they had created a silent dialogue that no one else fully understood, yet everyone felt. And as the courtroom waited, holding its collective breath, the story of a small girl and a police dog was just beginning, a story that would soon stop everything in its tracks. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm, the echo of gavel strikes and the rustle of papers creating a steady cadence. Witnesses spoke cautiously, lawyers gestured sharply, and Judge Harrison scribbled notes while keeping one eye on the proceedings. But amid the monotony, an unusual tension had begun to ripple through the gallery, unnoticed by most, but undeniable to those who knew where to look. At the back of the courtroom, the 3-year-old girl leaned slightly forward, her small fingers extended toward Max, the police dog. It was no longer a twitch or a playful point. This was intentional, deliberate, and full of quiet authority. Max, the trained German shepherd, shifted subtly, rising from his seated position. His massive frame moved with controlled precision, muscles coiled, tail still, eyes locked on the tiny figure at the back. Officer Daniels noticed immediately. The dog was reacting not to him, not to any command or sound in the room, but to Daniels' trained mind raced, calculating every possibility. This behavior was unusual, unprecedented, and demanding of attention. Max was obeying the untrained, silent signals of a toddler, something that challenged the very logic of canine obedience training. The mother of, who had been nervously holding her daughter's hand, felt her heart hammer in her chest. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" she whispered softly, trying to intervene but also realizing that her daughter seemed unusually focused. Didn't answer. She simply pointed again, her finger steady, eyes wide with concentration. The connection between the child and the dog was palpable. Max's ears flicked forward, and a subtle growl, almost inaudible, emanated from deep within him, a signal of alertness. To anyone not looking closely, he appeared calm, but the slightest observer could see the tension in his stance. Around them, the courtroom began to stir. A few keen eyes noticed the unusual behavior. The dog had moved from his position ever so slightly, yet deliberately, and his gaze never wavered from the child. Cameras clicked silently, journalists whispered into their recorders, and even the lawyers paused mid-sentence, sensing something extraordinary. Judge Harrison, finally looking up from his notes, noticed the shift. "Officer Daniels, is the dog behaving normally?" he asked, voice calm but laced with concern. Daniels nodded, though his jaw was tight. Yes, Your Honor, he's fine, but he's reacting to the child. The words barely left his lips before murmurs spread through the courtroom. A mix of disbelief and curiosity rippled across spectators. The child, whispered one lawyer to another. It's a toddler, a journalist muttered under her breath, raising her camera slightly. Even the witnesses leaned forward, trying to catch the slightest clue of what was happening. His finger hovered midair, her gaze unwavering. Max took another careful step toward her, slow and measured. The movement drew the attention of more people. Now the full weight of the situation began to sink in. The dog was responding to a child, an untrained 3-year-old girl, over the commands of his handler. The room's energy shifted from routine to tense curiosity. The air felt charged, thick with anticipation, as if the courtroom itself were holding its breath. Officer Daniels, though anxious, allowed the moment to unfold. Max had been trained to respond to subtle cues and alerts, but none of his training had prepared him for this. The instinctive guidance of a child, understood perfectly by the dog. The connection between and Max was unlike anything Daniels had ever witnessed. Every subtle twitch of the girl's finger, every tilt of her head carried meaning, and the dog recognized it instantly. It was a silent language, spoken only by innocence and instinct. Judge Harrison, Daniels whispered quietly, leaning toward the bench. He's responding to her, not me. The judge's eyes widened slightly. The courtroom had begun to notice the extraordinary scene unfolding at the back of the room. Whispers became audible. Spectators shifted, craning their necks to see the dog inch closer to the tiny girl. Lawyers froze mid-motion, unsure whether to proceed with testimony or wait. Cameras flashed discreetly. Journalists scribbled furiously. Even the court stenographer paused briefly, capturing the silent tension in her notes. Max stopped a few feet from his massive frame, poised, eyes fixed, ears forward. He lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging the child's authority, and waited. The subtle growl had ceased, replaced by a focused intensity, a readiness to act on command. His mother, though nervous, could not help but marvel at the scene. Her daughter, small and fragile by appearance, had somehow commanded the attention and obedience of a powerful, trained police dog. The juxtaposition was striking. A tiny child wielding influence over a creature that could easily overpower the adults around her. The judge banged the gavel lightly to regain focus. Everyone remained seated, he said, voice firm. The attorneys returned to their papers, though their eyes kept flicking toward the back of the courtroom. Witnesses sat upright, sensing something unusual. Max's handler remained tense, waiting for the dog to respond to normal commands, but Max ignored him entirely. The dog's loyalty in that moment belonged solely to. And unaware of the full weight of the courtroom's attention, pointed again, small fingers extended with precision. Then it happened. Max shifted one more step, stopping directly in front of the girl. His nose twitched, sniffing the air, ears alert, eyes unwavering. The courtroom collectively leaned forward. "Is the dog moving toward the child?" whispered one lawyer. Murmurs of disbelief spread like wildfire. Cameras clicked. A witness gasped quietly. Judge Harrison, sensing the moment's gravity, paused his note-taking and studied the scene intently. The room was now fully aware. A child's silent command had altered the dynamics of the courtroom. His gestures grew more deliberate. She leaned slightly to the side, tilting her head, signaling Max with subtle movements she likely didn't even understand herself. The dog responded immediately, shifting his weight, moving his paws with careful precision. Officer Daniels' jaw tightened. He knew that any sudden interference could break the delicate chain of communication between the child and his K-9 partner. He chose to hold back, observing the extraordinary interaction in stunned silence. Spectators now whispered openly. "That child, the dog, it's incredible," one said. Another added, "I've never seen a dog respond like that to anyone besides its handler." Journalists scribbled notes furiously, documenting the unusual moment. Even the court reporter typed slowly, captivated by the unfolding scene. All attention in the courtroom had shifted from the legal proceedings to the interaction between and Max. The tension was palpable. Every heartbeat seemed to echo through the silent spaces between whispers. The mother, realizing the full extent of what was happening, whispered softly to, "Honey, what are you doing?" Focus did not waver. She simply pointed once more, small, precise, and confident. Max responded by lowering his head slightly and stepping closer, almost as if acknowledging the authority of the tiny figure. In that instant, the courtroom collectively understood that something extraordinary was happening, a silent command, a wordless understanding, and a bond that logic. Officer Daniels finally exhaled slowly, though tension remained high. He had trained for countless scenarios with Max, but none involved a 3-year-old issuing commands understood perfectly by the dog. The quiet strength of gestures and Max's disciplined obedience had created a moment that could not be ignored. Even the judge, who prided himself on impartiality and composure, felt a flicker of awe. This was more than a distraction. It was a revelation. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Max paused, one paw slightly raised, his massive head tilted toward the child. Eyes sparkled with concentration, and she pointed again. The dog's response was immediate, a slow, deliberate step forward, controlled and precise. The courtroom was now fully captivated. Every spectator, every attorney, every officer, and even the judge watched in silent anticipation. The ordinary rhythms of a legal proceeding had been suspended, replaced by the extraordinary connection of child and dog. And so, in the back of a crowded courtroom, a tiny girl had taken command of a situation that no one else could understand. Max, obedient, intelligent, and trained for countless scenarios, had responded with complete focus. The tension in the room, quiet at first, had now reached a crescendo. The rest of the courtroom proceedings faded into background noise, and all eyes, whether consciously or not, were fixed on and Max. The first gesture, simple and small, had changed everything. The courtroom seemed to vibrate with a tension that no one could quite put into words. Max, the powerful German shepherd, had taken deliberate steps toward, ignoring all commands from his handler, Officer Daniels. The usual hum of legal procedure had faded, replaced by a palpable, electric anticipation. Every person in the room was suddenly aware that something extraordinary was happening, even if they couldn't fully understand it. Spectators leaned forward, witnesses froze mid-sentence, and lawyers paused mid-gesture, pens and papers forgotten in their hands. Small and fragile in her bright pink coat, remained poised, her tiny fingers pointed with quiet authority. Her gaze never wavered from Max. She had no idea that the simple act of pointing, instinctive and innocent, was holding the attention of dozens of adults and one of the most highly trained police dogs in the city. But Max understood. His ears flicked forward, tail rigid, muscles coiled beneath his shiny coat. Every subtle twitch of the child's finger sent signals he interpreted with precision. Officer Daniels exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. He had trained Max for countless scenarios, detecting explosives, drugs, and assisting in high-risk apprehensions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for a 3-year-old issuing an unspoken command that Max recognized instantly. "Stay calm," he whispered under his breath, both to himself and to the dog. Max hesitated only briefly, glancing at Daniels as if acknowledging his words, but his attention never wavered from. The mother, clutching her daughter's hand nervously, whispered, "Honey, what are you doing?" Didn't answer. She simply pointed again, small fingers firm and steady. Her eyes, wide with concentration, seemed almost to glow with determination. She was not aware of the magnitude of her actions. To her, it was a game of focus, attention, and trust. But in that courtroom, it was nothing less than extraordinary, a silent communication between innocence and instinct, intelligence and intuition. Max shifted slightly closer, each movement deliberate, careful, and controlled. His massive head tilted slightly to one side, ears forward, nostrils flaring gently as he scanned the air. The courtroom now fully noticed. Murmurs spread quickly among spectators. "Is that the dog moving toward her? I've never seen anything like it." Cameras clicked quietly as journalists tried to capture the scene without disrupting it. Witnesses turned their heads, unsure whether to continue testifying or simply watch. Even the stenographer paused, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Judge Harrison, a man accustomed to maintaining calm in tense situations, leaned forward, his hands resting on the gavel. His eyes narrowed in curiosity. "Officer Daniels," he said, voice steady, "explain what is happening." Daniels swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor," he's responding not to me but to the child. The courtroom seemed to collectively inhale at that revelation. Lawyers paused mid-argument. Witnesses blinked rapidly, trying to process the impossibility of the claim. The mother's grip on tightened, equal parts pride and apprehension. Max's next movement was deliberate but subtle. He lowered his head slightly, eyes locked on, his body poised for action but restrained by years of disciplined training. He had chosen, for reasons only he could understand, to obey her over anyone else in the room. The silence in the courtroom deepened, broken only by the occasional whisper or click of a camera. Every spectator was aware, consciously or subconsciously, that a moment of remarkable significance was unfolding. Pointed again, leaning slightly forward this time. Max's ears twitched, muscles flexed, and he took another step closer, halting only when he was a mere 3 feet from her. The precision and obedience were extraordinary. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a dog simply moving, but to those who understood, it was a display of comprehension, trust, and partnership. The bond between and Max, invisible to most, was undeniable. Whispers in the courtroom grew louder. "That child, she's controlling the dog," one spectator said, incredulous. Another muttered, "It's incredible, I've never seen obedience like that." Lawyers paused mid-note, scribbling furiously to capture the moment, and journalists leaned closer, their cameras trained on the tiny girl and her K-9 companion. Witnesses whispered softly among themselves, unsure whether to speak or simply watch. Even the judge, a man accustomed to high-pressure scenarios, felt a rare sense of wonder. Officer Daniels took a cautious step closer, speaking softly to Max. "Easy, boy." Max hesitated, briefly flicking his gaze toward Daniels, but then returned to his focus on. The dog's decision was clear. He would follow her silent command, not the voice of his handler. The subtle defiance, tempered by obedience, was remarkable. Daniels felt a mixture of awe and unease. He had trained dogs for years, but none had ever responded with such unerring precision to a child's instinctive gesture. The courtroom seemed frozen in that moment. Time slowed as Max adjusted his stance, ears forward, muscles coiled like a spring, ready to respond to any further cue from the girl. Pointed again, subtly but with confidence. The dog shifted slightly, a controlled movement that demonstrated complete understanding. Every eye in the room was now fixed on the child and the dog. Conversations had ceased. The normal rhythm of legal proceedings had paused. Spectators, witnesses, and even the judge had become witnesses to something extraordinary. His mother whispered softly again, "Sweetheart, just sit still," but barely registered it. She was focused entirely on Max, confident that he understood her. The child's small gestures carried weight beyond her comprehension. The dog's response was disciplined and precise, a rare combination of instinct and training. Every subtle signal from the girl was interpreted instantly and acted upon with unwavering attention. Judge Harrison finally rose slightly, gavel in hand. "Everyone remain seated," he commanded, though his voice carried the awe that he could not hide. Lawyers nodded, witnesses froze, and spectators leaned forward, all aware that the dynamics of the courtroom had shifted. Max remained poised before, his massive head tilted slightly, eyes locked on hers. The bond between the child and the dog was visible to anyone who looked closely enough, and the significance of the moment was unmistakable. The mother's heart raced. She watched her daughter, small and delicate, commanding the obedience of a powerful and highly trained police dog. The magnitude of the situation was overwhelming, yet remained calm, unaware of the attention she had drawn. The child's instinctive gestures had created a silent dialogue, one that no one in the courtroom could fully understand, yet everyone felt. Max's final movement in that sequence was deliberate. He lowered his head, sitting slightly, eyes still locked on the girl, tail still and body poised. The courtroom gasped collectively. The murmurs grew louder. Cameras clicked, witnesses whispered, and lawyers exchanged stunned glances. Officer Daniels exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. This was unprecedented. The dog had chosen, without hesitation, to follow a 3-year-old girl's silent instructions over all others in the room. For a brief moment, the courtroom seemed to exist in two realities, one of mundane legal proceedings and another of extraordinary, almost magical connection between child and dog. Unaware of the awe she had inspired, leaned slightly, pointing once more. Max's eyes flickered with understanding, muscles coiled, and the room collectively held its breath. Whatever came next, it was clear that this was no ordinary courtroom day. A quiet, powerful, and unprecedented moment had taken hold, one that would ripple through every observer, leaving them stunned, inspired, and deeply aware of the incredible bond between and Max. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the unusual scene unfolding at the back of the courtroom. Max, the massive German shepherd, remained poised a mere 3 feet from, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on the tiny girl. His body was taut but disciplined, a perfect display of obedience and attentiveness, but it wasn't to Officer Daniels, as protocol would dictate. Instead, the dog's focus belonged entirely to a 3-year-old girl whose small finger now pointed deliberately toward him. The judge had seen many unusual courtroom occurrences in his years on the bench, but this was unprecedented. "Officer Daniels," the judge said firmly, rising slightly from his chair, "explain exactly what is happening here." His voice was calm yet carried an edge of authority. All eyes in the courtroom turned toward the K9 handler. Daniels swallowed, trying to steady his voice as he responded. "Your Honor, Max. He's responding to the child, not me. I've never seen this before." The words barely left his lips before whispers spread across the courtroom like wildfire. Spectators craned their necks to see the child and the dog. Lawyers paused mid-gesture, pens and papers abandoned for the moment. Witnesses leaned forward, mouths slightly open, unsure whether to continue giving testimony or simply watch. Even the court reporter stopped typing, fingers hovering above the keyboard as if frozen by the surreal moment. Cameras clicked discreetly as journalists tried to capture the scene without disrupting it. The courtroom had collectively shifted from formal proceedings to silent observation of something extraordinary. Judge Harrison's brow furrowed in concern and curiosity. "Is the dog under control?" he asked, voice steady but tense. Daniels nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor, he's disciplined, he's just, responding to the child." The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, eyes wide. He was a man accustomed to order and procedure, but here, in front of him, a tiny child had captured the attention of a trained police dog in a way that explanation. Still focused, pointed once more. Max responded with subtle precision, muscles coiling slightly, head tilting, ears forward. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like simple attention, but those paying close attention, Judge Harrison, Daniels, and a few keen-eyed spectators, recognized the extraordinary intelligence and awareness on display. This was not play. This was recognition, understanding, and obedience. The courtroom murmurs grew louder. "That child, she's controlling the dog," whispered one spectator. "It's incredible," another said, camera poised. Lawyers exchanged glances, some doubtful, some fascinated. Witnesses craned their necks, unsure whether to proceed or simply watch the unfolding spectacle. Even Officer Daniels felt a sense of awe mixed with concern. He had trained Max for countless real-life scenarios, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. A 3-year-old was issuing signals, interpreted perfectly by a massive, disciplined K9. Judge Harrison banged his gavel lightly to regain composure. "Everyone remain seated," he commanded, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable sense of authority. He leaned slightly forward, studying the child and the dog. Max remained poised, his eyes locked on. Every muscle in his body indicated focus and readiness. It was clear. The dog was waiting for the child's next signal. The judge, sensing the gravity of the moment, called a short recess. The murmurs and whispers in the courtroom intensified as officers quietly gathered near Max and Daniels. Spectators craned forward, journalists scribbled furiously, and lawyers whispered among themselves, unsure how to proceed. The mother's hand trembled as she held her daughter, marveling at what her child had achieved without even understanding it. His tiny finger pointed again, and Max responded with another subtle shift, acknowledging the gesture as an instruction. "Your Honor," Daniel said quietly, leaning toward the bench. "Max is trained for alerts and commands, but this is different. He's responding exclusively to her, and it's precise, deliberate." The judge's expression softened slightly, his eyes widening in realization. He had overseen dozens of high-stakes courtroom situations, but never had he witnessed a moment where the innocence of a child could direct the actions of a trained K-9. The mother leaned over and whispered softly to, "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Didn't answer. She simply pointed, small but confident. The dog's massive head tilted slightly, ears forward, muscles coiled, ready to act if needed. It was a silent dialogue of trust, instinct, and understanding. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. He had made a decision. This moment required full attention, caution, and respect. The spectators had now fully realized the extraordinary nature of the interaction. Cameras clicked, flashes lighting the room subtly. Journalists whispered into microphones, documenting the unprecedented scene. Lawyers stopped arguing, pens froze in mid-note. Witnesses, once tense and nervous, now watched in fascination. The courtroom, usually a place of procedure and decorum, had become a stage for something miraculous: the bond and communication between a child and a police dog. Max shifted slightly closer, a subtle but deliberate movement, lowering his head and keeping his massive body perfectly poised. Gestures, though small, were precise. She pointed again, and Max responded, muscles tensing just enough to signal comprehension. Every subtle movement carried weight, and the courtroom understood, though not fully, what was occurring. This was not disobedience. It was obedience of a new, almost instinctive order. Judge Harrison finally stood, signaling all attorneys and spectators to remain calm and attentive. "I need a brief recess," he announced, "to ensure that everyone and everything remains safe." His voice carried authority, but also an unmistakable sense of awe. Officers nodded quickly, moving toward Max, ready to intervene if necessary. Spectators leaned forward, captivated. Journalists raised cameras, capturing what could only be described as a once-in-a-lifetime moment. The mother whispered again, "Sweetheart, just be careful." Unaware of the full magnitude of her actions, pointed one last time for the moment, her small hand steady. Max, obedient and precise, mirrored her gestures subtly, a silent acknowledgement. The tension in the room was nearly unbearable, every heartbeat amplified by anticipation. Judge Harrison, Officer Daniels, and everyone in the courtroom were now fully aware that this was extraordinary. For a brief moment, the courtroom seemed suspended in time. All legal arguments, testimonies, and procedures faded into the background. What remained was a quiet, powerful dialogue between innocence and instinct, child and dog. Max, massive and disciplined, waited attentively for the next signal. Small and unaware of the attention she had drawn, continued to point with delicate authority. And in that moment, everyone understood something remarkable, perhaps unprecedented, was occurring. The judge's gavel, resting lightly in his hand, symbolized authority and order, but even he recognized that the order of this courtroom had shifted. A 3-year-old girl had, with nothing more than instinct and trust, commanded the attention and obedience of a highly trained police dog. The realization sent shivers through spectators, witnesses, and officers alike. Every movement, every gesture carried weight. Every eye in the room remained fixed on the child and the dog, as if fearing that blinking might cause them to miss a single, extraordinary moment. And so the courtroom waited. The legal proceedings were paused, the atmosphere heavy with suspense, and every person present felt a quiet awe. His gestures had captured the attention of Max, the judge, the officers, the lawyers, and the spectators. Time seemed to stretch as the bond between the child and the dog became the focus of the room. The judge, now fully alert to the gravity of the situation, knew that what happened next would be critical. Max shifted slightly, a deliberate, precise movement signaling his readiness to respond further. Pointed again, small, deliberate, confident. The room remained silent, every heartbeat audible, every breath held in anticipation. Witnesses whispered softly, lawyers leaned forward, journalists raised cameras. The extraordinary bond between child and dog had become the center of the courtroom, and all knew that the proceedings and perhaps the day itself would never be the same. Judge Harrison exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the scene. "We will pause proceedings," he announced firmly. "This situation requires full attention and careful observation." The words were calm, yet the authority behind them was undeniable. Officers moved quietly to ensure safety, journalists documented every second, and spectators leaned forward in anticipation. Small Finger, Max's disciplined gaze, and the silent dialogue between them had stopped the courtroom in its tracks. In that moment, the world outside the courtroom ceased to matter. A child's innocence, instinct, and quiet determination had captured the attention of an entire room of adults, including the judge himself. The extraordinary moment would soon unfold further, revealing the remarkable story of trust, intuition, and communication that only a 3-year-old girl and a police dog could share. The courtroom, though paused, was far from silent. Spectators leaned forward in anticipation, whispers rippling like waves. Cameras were poised, journalists scribbled frantically, and lawyers exchanged stunned glances. The air was thick with tension, charged by the unusual, unexplainable bond forming between a 3-year-old girl and a massive, highly trained police dog. Max remained motionless, yet alert, his gaze locked on as if reading her very thoughts. Officer Daniels, kneeling beside him, tried to maintain calm, though every instinct told him this was unlike any situation he had ever encountered. His mother watched anxiously, realizing her daughter had somehow become the center of the room's attention. She whispered gently, "Sweetheart, what is it? What are you trying to tell him?" With the innocence and focus of a child entirely unaware of her audience, tilted her head slightly and pointed. It was subtle but precise, a gesture she had perfected during months of practice at home with Max in the park. This was not play, it was communication, a secret signal only she and Max understood. Max shifted slightly, lowering his head in acknowledgement. His massive body remained coiled with energy, yet controlled. Daniels felt a twinge of awe mixed with anxiety. Police dogs were trained to recognize a wide range of cues, from voice commands to hand signals, even subtle body movements. But this was instinctive. A tiny human child had created a signal so clear, so compelling, that Max responded without hesitation, overriding his handler's authority. The judge, standing behind the bench with his gavel resting lightly in his hand, observed carefully. His voice broke the murmurs. "Officer Daniels, do we need to take precautionary measures? Is the child in danger?" Daniels shook his head quickly. "No, Your Honor, it's not danger. He's alert, responding to her, but she's safe. This is something else entirely." The judge's eyes widened and he leaned forward. Everyone realized that what was happening went beyond normal procedure. Pointed again, her small finger extended with quiet confidence. Max's ears flicked forward. His tail was still, yet his muscles tensed as if ready to move at her command. The subtle growl that had been heard earlier returned, low and controlled, signaling heightened awareness. It was clear to anyone paying attention. This was not ordinary interaction. Had somehow communicated a need for vigilance, and Max, trained to detect danger, had understood. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity. Lawyers whispered among themselves. Witnesses leaned forward. Spectators, once focused on legal proceedings, were now captivated by a silent story unfolding at the back of the room. Journalists raised cameras and recorded every moment, recognizing that this scene was unprecedented. A 3-year-old had captured the attention and obedience of a police dog trained for life-or-death situations. Every subtle gesture she made carried enormous weight. His mother realized the magnitude of her daughter's actions. She leaned close, whispering softly, "Sweetheart, tell me what's going on." Glanced at her mother briefly, then returned her gaze to Max. Her small finger twitched, and her lips moved silently, a tiny murmur only she and Max could understand. This was their secret signal, a prearranged gesture they had practiced at home during play and training exercises. It had never been tested in a real, high-pressure environment like a courtroom. Max's response was immediate. He shifted closer to, his massive paws barely making a sound on the polished floor. His head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Daniels watched in awe. The dog's training had prepared him to follow hand signals, voice commands, and situational cues, but never had he followed one so subtle, so instinctive from a toddler. It was a testament to the bond they had developed over months of practice and trust. Judge Harrison, sensing the significance, adjusted his stance behind the bench. "This is highly unusual," he murmured under his breath. His voice carried enough for a few nearby officers to hear. Spectators leaned closer. Lawyers exchanged astonished glances. Max remained motionless yet alert, as though standing guard while waiting for further instruction from the child. The courtroom had become a theater of silent communication, every participant aware that something extraordinary was happening. The mother finally understood. "She's signaling something," she whispered to Daniels, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. "She's not just playing, she's warning him. She's telling him something important." Daniels nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Max. "I can see it. He's on alert but controlled. He's ready. Whatever she's signaling, he understands. It's remarkable." The mother's heart pounded, realizing that her daughter had unknowingly created a communication system that was both precise and life-saving. Pointed again, this time more deliberately, and Max responded with a slow, deliberate shift of his body. His massive head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring, ears forward. His muscles tensed, but he remained poised, ready for action if needed. Every person in the courtroom recognized the extraordinary precision and discipline of the dog's movements. It was as if he were following an invisible command only he and the child could see. The judge called for a brief pause in proceedings. "We need to ensure that this situation is fully understood before continuing," he announced, voice firm but tinged with awe. Officers moved closer to Max, ready to assist if necessary, but careful not to interrupt the bond forming between him and. The spectators watched in silence, their curiosity now mixed with admiration. This was more than a simple gesture. It was a secret language that conveyed awareness, trust, and alertness. Small finger twitched one final time, signaling Max with quiet authority. The dog responded by shifting slightly closer, as if acknowledging her signal. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every breath held in anticipation. Judge Harrison, Officer Daniels, lawyers, witnesses, and spectators alike were all captivated by this silent, extraordinary dialogue. It was in that moment that the secret of gestures became clear. Though she was unaware of the magnitude of her actions, she had developed a precise signal for alerting Max to potential danger or unusual behavior. The child's innocence combined with her understanding of the dog's instincts had created a unique communication system. Max had interpreted it flawlessly, demonstrating the power of trust, intuition, and the bond between human and animal. The courtroom was now fully attentive. Spectators whispered softly, cameras flashed discreetly, and journalists documented every detail. Lawyers paused mid-argument, witnesses leaned forward, and even the judge watched intently. Max, poised and disciplined, remained entirely focused on. The tiny child had, without words, commanded the attention of the entire courtroom and the obedience of a police dog. Officer Daniels finally exhaled, a mixture of relief and admiration evident on his face. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "she's safe. Max understands her signal perfectly and there's no danger here. This is extraordinary but controlled." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, absorbing the information. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. His mother, now fully aware of what had just occurred, whispered softly, "My little girl, she's amazing," glanced up briefly, then returned her gaze to Max. The dog, massive yet obedient, responded with subtle precision to her next gesture. The secret signal they had developed at home had not only been recognized, but had captivated an entire courtroom. The extraordinary bond between child and dog was now on full display, leaving everyone present in awe. And so the moment passed, but its significance lingered. His gestures had communicated a secret signal only she and Max understood, demonstrating the power of trust, intuition, and quiet authority. The courtroom, once focused on legal proceedings, had become a witness to an extraordinary interaction, a silent dialogue between innocence and instinct that no one would soon forget. The courtroom had fallen into a rare, almost surreal silence. Spectators, lawyers, witnesses, and even the judge were fully focused on the small figure at the back of the room, the 3-year-old girl, and the massive, disciplined police dog Max. Every heartbeat seemed amplified. Every breath, every subtle shift in the dog's posture was noticed. Max remained poised, his eyes locked on, his massive body coiled with anticipation. The subtle gestures the girl had been sending all along, the secret signals, had guided him to this moment. Unaware of the impact she had created, tilted her tiny head slightly and pointed, her small finger extending with quiet authority. To her, it was simply another step in the silent game she had been playing with Max for months at the park. But here in the courtroom, it was far more than a game. Max, trained to interpret the slightest cue, understood the meaning perfectly. His ears flicked forward, nostrils flared subtly, and his muscles tensed as he prepared for the action the signal demanded. Officer Daniels felt a sudden tightening in his chest. He had trained Max for years to respond to countless scenarios. Suspect apprehension, detecting explosives, crowd control, but nothing had prepared him for this. A toddler's instinctive signal, unspoken and delicate, had elicited the kind of alertness and obedience that even the most advanced training could barely achieve. He whispered softly to the dog, "Easy, stay," but Max ignored him entirely, eyes never leaving. The mother's hand tightened around her daughter's small frame. "Sweetie," she whispered, nervous yet amazed, did not respond verbally. She simply extended her finger one last time, pointing deliberately. That small gesture, practiced at home but untested in real life, had now become a command of extraordinary power. Max shifted, and this time it was unmistakable, a deliberate, forward step, controlled yet unmistakably purposeful. The courtroom collectively gasped. Spectators leaned forward, whispers rippled like waves, and journalists lifted cameras, capturing the unprecedented scene. Lawyers froze mid-gesture, pens paused over notebooks. Witnesses leaned in, wide-eyed. Even Judge Harrison, who had seen countless tense situations in his career, felt a shiver run down his spine. Something extraordinary was unfolding, and it was entirely unplanned. Max's massive head tilted slightly, his gaze unwavering. Every muscle in his body indicated readiness, yet restraint. The low, controlled growl that had signaled alertness earlier returned, deeper this time, resonating throughout the room. The sound, subtle yet powerful, drew attention from every corner of the courtroom. The murmurs intensified. Some spectators whispered, "Is he warning of something?" Others shook their heads in disbelief. Even the officers present took a step closer, wary of the unusual behavior. Judge Harrison banged his gavel lightly, trying to regain order. "Everyone remain calm," he commanded, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his astonishment. Officer Daniels explained this behavior again. Daniels exhaled slowly. "Your Honor, Max is responding to the child's signal, a prearranged gesture we developed at home. He is alert, focused, and ready to act. There's no danger to anyone, but he is entirely under the child's direction at this moment." The spectators, though puzzled, now understood the weight of the moment. A 3-year-old had, through subtle, practiced gestures, commanded the obedience and alertness of a police dog trained for life-or-death situations. The realization rippled through the courtroom like an electric current. Cameras clicked repeatedly, journalists whispered into microphones, and witnesses stared, unable to look away. Even the lawyers, whose minds were usually consumed with facts and legal strategy, were captivated by the unusual bond unfolding before them. Then it happened. Extended her tiny finger again, the gesture small but deliberate, precise in a way that only Max could interpret. In response, Max shifted forward decisively. The movement was controlled, yet purposeful, signaling recognition of a potential unseen threat. The dog's massive paws clicked softly against the polished floor as he took another measured step toward, his eyes scanning the courtroom for anything unusual. It was a demonstration of alertness, focus, and obedience that no adult could replicate. Judge Harrison's eyes widened. "Stop!" he exclaimed, but even he paused mid-word as the full significance became clear. The dog's attention was singular, entirely focused on the child, responding to a signal no one else could see or understand. The courtroom fell completely silent, the usual rustle of papers and distant murmurs replaced by the hum of anticipation. Every person present felt the tension, the unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was happening. Officer Daniels finally spoke aloud, a whisper that carried across the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor, he's alerting, he senses something. The child's signal, it's working." The words sent a ripple through the room. Spectators leaned forward, straining to understand. Journalists clicked cameras repeatedly, capturing every nuance of Max's posture. Lawyers paused mid-conversation, stunned into silence. Even the judge, whose life revolved around control and procedure, realized that the courtroom itself had been transformed into a stage for an incredible interaction. Max's movement became more pronounced. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring, ears forward, tail rigid yet controlled. Every muscle in his body indicated vigilance. Small and delicate, maintained her posture, pointing with quiet confidence. The child and dog, connected by a silent language of trust and instinct, had paused the entire courtroom without a single spoken word. The room's atmosphere was thick with awe and disbelief. Spectators whispered nervously among themselves. "It's like he understands her," one said. "No dog should be this responsive to a child," murmured another. Journalists typed rapidly, trying to capture the scene in words that would convey its rare and remarkable nature. Witnesses leaned forward, craning their necks, unable to tear their eyes away. The courtroom had been transformed from a place of routine proceedings into a witness to an extraordinary act of communication and connection. His mother, torn between nervousness and pride, whispered softly, "My baby, she's amazing." Unaware of the gravity of her actions, simply pointed again. Max responded immediately, shifting slightly forward, eyes locked, muscles taut. The subtle growl returned, low and controlled, a clear indication of alertness. The secret signal, the gesture that only she and Max understood, had now reached its climax. Judge Harrison's gavel struck the bench, but it barely seemed to register in the room. "Everyone, remain calm," he said again, his voice firm yet reverent. Officers moved cautiously, ready to intervene if necessary, yet careful not to disrupt the bond forming between the child and the dog. The room was silent except for the soft clicks of Max's paws and the whispered murmur of awe from spectators. Then in one decisive moment, Max's massive head tilted slightly, ears forward, tail rigid, and he barked once, sharp, controlled, and deliberate. The single bark echoed through the courtroom. Gasps followed. Spectators froze. Lawyers' pens hovered in midair. Witnesses blinked rapidly. Cameras clicked repeatedly. Even Judge Harrison paused, stunned by the clarity and authority of the action. The courtroom, long accustomed to routine, had been stopped entirely by a silent command from a child and the precise obedience of a police dog. The judge rose slowly from his bench, gavel in hand. "Everyone remain where you are," he commanded, his voice carrying both authority and awe. Max, massive and disciplined, lowered his head slightly but remained focused, his posture unwavering. Small and confident, maintained her gesture, the secret signal complete. The room was still, stunned, and entirely captivated by the extraordinary bond and communication on display. In that moment, everyone understood. The routine of the courtroom had been suspended, order had been redirected, and the attention of dozens of adults, including the judge himself, had been captured by the unspoken dialogue between a child and a dog. Had signaled, Max had responded, and the courtroom had stopped, frozen in awe at a bond that explanation. The courtroom remained frozen, every eye fixed on the small girl and the massive German shepherd standing before her. Max, disciplined and alert, had executed the silent command perfectly. His single, deliberate bark had rippled through the room like a signal, pausing time for everyone present. The ordinary rhythm of legal proceedings had been suspended. Spectators, lawyers, witnesses, journalists, and even Judge Harrison were united in stunned silence. No one could speak, move, or even breathe easily. The spectacle before them had seized the room entirely. Unaware of the full impact of her actions, tilted her head slightly and pointed again, small fingers steady. Max lowered his massive head slightly in acknowledgement, ears forward, nostrils flaring subtly, tail rigid yet controlled. Officer Daniels watched, all written across his face. He had trained Max for years, but nothing could have prepared him for a moment like this, where a 3-year-old, guided by instinct and trust, commanded a highly trained police dog with flawless precision. Judge Harrison finally exhaled slowly, raising his gavel. "Order restored," he said, his voice calm yet carrying unmistakable reverence. The words were more symbolic than functional. The courtroom had already been changed. Lawyers returned to their seats, some still scribbling notes frantically. Spectators leaned back, whispering excitedly to one another, sharing their disbelief. Witnesses sat upright, their expressions a mix of awe and admiration. Cameras clicked as journalists documented the final moments, aware that they had just witnessed something historic. Max remained close to, his massive body relaxed slightly but still alert, eyes locked on hers. The silent communication between them, the prearranged gestures, the subtle signals practiced at home, had demonstrated a bond and understanding that ordinary explanation. Officer Daniels approached cautiously, crouching beside the dog. "He's fine," he murmured to the judge, "and she's safe. But what they share, it's extraordinary." The judge nodded, his gaze lingering on the pair. "Extraordinary indeed," he said softly. "I have presided over countless cases, witnessed tensions escalate and observed moments of bravery and courage, but never have I seen a display of communication and trust like this. This child, this dog, they share something rare and remarkable." The courtroom remained attentive, absorbing every word. His mother, finally able to speak aloud, whispered almost to herself, "My little girl and Max, they understand each other." She reached down, brushing a loose strand of hair from his forehead, looked up at her mother briefly, then returned her gaze to Max, small fingers extending in a final gesture of connection. Max's eyes softened ever so slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of the bond they shared. Officer Daniels stood, straightening. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "Max has never responded this way to anyone, but her signals, though simple to the eye, are precise. He interprets them as commands, alerts, and cues for vigilance. It's remarkable and completely controlled. There's no danger." The judge listened carefully, nodding in understanding. The courtroom's tension began to ease, replaced by admiration for the unique bond on display. Spectators began to murmur softly, sharing their amazement. Some whispered, "I've never seen a dog respond like that to a child." Others nodded, cameras still poised. Lawyers and witnesses exchanged astonished glances. Even the journalists who had documented countless events typed notes with heightened excitement. The story of a 3-year-old commanding a police dog had already become unforgettable. Judge Harrison's voice rose again, commanding attention. "We will now resume proceedings, but with full recognition that today's events are extraordinary. Let it be noted in the record that the behavior demonstrated by the child and the police dog is unprecedented and remarkable." A hush fell over the room. Max relaxed slightly, though he remained attentive too. Every person present felt the weight of those words, understanding the rarity and significance of what had just transpired. The mother, holding back tears, whispered softly, "You did it," glanced at her mother briefly, then back at Max, still engaged in the silent dialogue only they could share. It was as though nothing else mattered, words, authority, or rules. In that moment, the bond between child and dog had transcended everything else in the room. Officer Daniels finally spoke aloud, addressing the judge and courtroom. "Max is trained to respond to potential threats, to act with precision in high-risk situations. But today, he responded to a signal from this child. Her gestures, her focus, her instincts all guided him perfectly. I've never seen anything like it. Spectators nodded, some gasping softly. The journalists clicked cameras and scribbled notes, knowing they had witnessed a story unlike any other. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Max intently. It is rare that we witness such trust, such instinct, and such clarity of communication. A child's innocence paired with a dog's training has created a bond that transcends ordinary understanding. This will be remembered. The room remained silent, everyone processing the extraordinary events. Finally, the gavel struck lightly. We will proceed with the case, but let us not forget what we have seen. Let the record reflect the actions of the child and the dog, who together demonstrated an extraordinary connection that stopped this courtroom and commanded our attention. The words echoed in the room, a formal acknowledgement of the miracle that had just unfolded. His mother smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "My little girl and Max, they're incredible," she whispered again, proud beyond words. Still focused on Max, extended her tiny finger one last time. Max responded, a subtle tilt of his head and a soft wag of his tail, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The room had returned to order, but no one would ever forget the pause, the moment of awe, and the silent communication that had held everyone's attention. Spectators began to relax, whispers turning to conversation. Journalists continued documenting the event, lawyers returned to their work, and witnesses resumed their seats. Officer Daniels patted Max on the shoulder gently, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You did well, boy," he murmured. Max remained calm, eyes still occasionally flicking toward, a silent bond that would endure far beyond the courtroom walls. Judge Harrison, finally allowing the proceedings to continue, addressed the room. "Let us proceed, but let this day serve as a reminder of the extraordinary connections that can exist between humans and animals. A child's trust, a dog's instinct, and their mutual understanding can create moments that inspire, astonish, and humble us all." The room remained attentive, absorbing the wisdom in the statement. His gestures, once subtle, had now become legendary within that courtroom. The child, oblivious to the attention she had commanded, simply held Max's gaze, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. The bond they shared, honed through trust and practice, had achieved something remarkable. It had stopped a courtroom, commanded the attention of adults, and demonstrated the extraordinary potential of understanding between species. As proceedings resumed, the energy in the room was forever changed. Spectators whispered excitedly, journalists documented every detail, and lawyers glanced toward the back of the courtroom, still captivated by the memory of what had occurred. Max remained attentive, ready to respond to silent commands, while the child continued to exhibit the confidence and focus that had guided them through this extraordinary event. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the story of Max had spread quietly among those present. The courtroom had witnessed something rare, a silent, extraordinary communication between innocence and instinct. The bond between a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had been recognized, admired, and recorded, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had been there. And as her mother left the courtroom, Max walking calmly beside them, Officer Daniels followed with a quiet sense of awe. What had begun as a routine day in court had transformed into a story of trust, intuition, and an extraordinary bond that could not be ignored. A small gesture had led to an unforgettable moment, one that would be recounted countless times. The day a 3-year-old girl pointed at a police dog, and the entire courtroom stopped, stunned, witnessing the power of innocence, trust, and instinct working together.